From the Harvard Business School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the second of two special editions on American competitiveness. In the next half hour, we'll examine a central challenge to American business, restoring quality in manufacturing and regaining the competitive edge. We'll hear from Professor Robert Hayes, an expert on managing for manufacturing excellence, David Garvin, a specialist in quality control, and Janice McCormick, whose studies of labor relations reveal lessons for managing today's workforce. Winning through manufacturing, what tomorrow's business leaders need to know in order to compete. From Cambridge, Massachusetts, this is American Interests. American Interests is made possible by IBM and Pfizer, Inc. and these leading foundations.
Welcome to American Interests. I'm Morton Kondracki. By now, it's a common observation that American industry is in decline. Here at the Harvard Business School, people are planning a comeback strategy for America. For the next half hour, we'll continue our discussion with people who are training young Americans to compete in the global economy.
Each year, hundreds of graduates leave the Harvard Business School for the most desirable jobs in American business. In 1960, almost half went to work in manufacturing. Today, Wall Street and consulting firms draw the most graduates, while only 23% go into the manufacturing sector. This decline reflects a larger business trend. Once the unchallenged leader in manufacturing, the U.S. now faces tough foreign competition in auto and steel production. And while many American companies have moved manufacturing operations offshore, some foreign firms have successfully opened new plants here in the U.S. In a landmark article in the Harvard Business Review written in 1973, Professor Robert Hayes launched a movement to reevaluate America's approach to manufacturing.
How did we go from being, as I gather we once were, a manufacturing-first country where presumably long-term investment meant something, to a country that was more interested in quick turnaround of money and making piles of money on mergers and acquisitions?
First of all, we came out of the war with the Second World War with a tremendous, not only intact productive capacity, but we were acknowledged as the masters of manufacturing around the world. The Japanese, the Europeans came here to our factories to see how we did things. In that environment, where we were trying to supply not only the pent-up needs of our own domestic economy, but the rest of the world, and where manufacturing seemed to be under control, I think it was natural for a lot of companies to turn their attention to first marketing issues and then financial issues. The squeaking wheel got the oil. And the idea was that manufacturing is fine, it'll take care of itself. Now, in the process of doing this, we became distracted from manufacturing, and we started doing some things which actually not only caused it to suffer by benign neglect, but actually undermined it. And unless you have somebody in manufacturing or people in top management who understand how manufacturing works, what it needs to be vigorous and dynamic and growing and improving, you can do some things that ultimately cripple it, and cripple it for a rather long period of time. Marketing, for example, in its interests, can start adding products onto a line, onto a product line. It can start moving into different markets, and if it keeps trying to push more and more variety of products into a manufacturing organization, it can cause that organization to lose focus, to become confused, and to lose effectiveness. If too much financial consideration gets in there, if your systems for evaluating investments in plant and equipment become too numerical, you start losing sight of the fact that a piece of equipment is not only a productive piece of equipment, it's a laboratory instrument. You learn how to make a certain product, how to use a certain technology, how to do a certain job better. And if you don't factor that learning, the fact that this can lead eventually to new processes, better products, and so forth, if you don't factor that into your investment proposals, a lot of investments don't look economically attractive. Mm-hmm. And so we stopped making investments. We stopped taking the lead.
Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, the Japanese were doing it some different way.
Well, the different way, the way they learned from us.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I was just in Japan last week, and several times I said, well, where did you learn how to do it this way? Well, we learned it from some American company whom they'd visited 25, 30 years ago. It's not that they're doing something dramatically different from our cultural heritage. It's that they're doing the things that we used to do, and the question is, why did we stop doing them?
In all these discussions, one thing that gets left out, I mean, American companies are very profitable. Now, if they're very profitable, how come we have this competitiveness problem?
I think that's, again, taking a short-term look at a long-term problem. The statistics I've seen, and they're becoming more and more persuasive, if you look at various indices of profitability in the same industry, in, let's say, Germany, the US, and Japan, and then look at growth rate or market share, you see a very clear pattern in industry after industry, and that is the US typically has the highest profitability, often in the order of twice the profitability of our German and Japanese competitors, and the slowest growth rate. In effect, then, we're trading profits today for market position.
Well, that means now what's happening to those profits? In other words, they're not being invested in the future of the company. They're rather being parceled out to stockholders.
If you increase your prices above those of your competitors, you'll make more money for every unit you sell, and you'll progressively sell less units. This is the strategy that U.S. Steel has been following for 70 years. They started off with the great lion's share of the market share in the U.S. steel industry. They sold off that share little by little over the years by providing a price umbrella. The other thing is, the one you mentioned, is the reinvesting. Anytime you want to show a high profitability, you slow down your rate of investment. And the most profitable time for a company is often between the time it stops investing and the time it goes out of business.
If you were a corporate manager, or what is it that you tell these corporate managers that they need to do in the industries that you know best?
Change everything. I'm in the process of just finishing a book where the substance of the book is, look, we have a problem. It hasn't gone away in these 8 years since I wrote that article. It's gotten worse. More and more people are appreciating the problem. We have a lot of people who are going out and looking at the problem who say this is what companies have to do. And they're speaking with a relatively united voice. They agree that quality is important and manufacturing is important. Now, why haven't companies responded to that? And the answer, in my view, is because you can't just change one little thing in a company. If you're going to change a company, change its culture, change its vision, change its sense of values, you have to change the way it measures performance. The cost accounting systems around the world, in a sense, are based on a framework that was developed over 100 years ago to run textile mills and railroads and retail stores. At that time, labor costs, direct labor costs, were often 30 to 40% of total costs. Overhead was relatively small, 5 to 10%. So the idea was, if you want to allocate these overhead costs, the way to do it is to measure very carefully the direct labor costs and use it to allocate the overhead costs. Today, in many industries, those ratios are exactly the reverse. Direct labor is now less than 10% in the high-tech industries. In the computer industry, it's often less than 5%. Overhead is 35, 40, 50%, 10 times in some cases what direct labor is. Now, to take 5% direct labor and use it to allocate the overhead costs.
This is for accounting and tax purposes?
For accounting and tax purposes and internal measurement. I mean, it's driving internal behavior. People focus all their attention.
It's just a totally inaccurate picture of what the real cost of the company.
You're focusing on exactly the wrong things. You're focusing on direct labor. You ought to be focusing on how do you make the organization work better so it doesn't need all the overhead in there. In capital budgeting, again, we tend to have we've formalized capital budgeting. We made it almost totally driven by financial criteria. When you make a capital investment, though, you have to differentiate between something like buying a machine that is just like all the other machines you've been using for the last 20 years, and for the same market and so forth. Well, this machine, can you do a financial analysis of it? Absolutely. You can do one very easily. Let's think of another investment, an R&D, let's say, proposal, to invest in a new kind of technology. Very different. What kind of returns are you going to get from it? You don't know. What's it going to lead to? You don't know. Well, should you use the same method you use to evaluate this machine for evaluating the R&D proposal? Of course not. Absolutely.
But they are being used as the same.
But they are, because the equipment, some of the equipment we're buying today, particularly the new manufacturing technologies that are coming through, are much more like this R&D center than they are like this machine. Yet we're measuring equipment without taking into account what you can learn.
Yes, and the organizational structure, what would you do to
the organizational structures? We've tended to fragment them, to decentralize them, to divide up technological expertise. And I think what we have to do is bring organizations back together. Right now, we have measurement systems within an organization which drive people to compete with each other. You design different measures to measure the person who's in charge of quality from the person who's in charge of, let's say, productivity. and those measures cause them, when they come to some issue that is a common problem, they often will fight each other because their performance is being measured. You have to bring them together and give them more, measure them more on group performance and bring them under a single command rather than divide up the command.
Right.
Consumer acceptance is the ultimate test of product success. While cost remains a significant factor in consumer decisions, some claim that U.S. manufacturers have paid too little attention to the most important factor in manufacturing competitiveness: quality. David Garvin is the author of extensive comparative studies of American and Japanese products.
Can you make a generalized statement that the Japanese are producing, product for product, much higher quality goods than American companies are producing?
We have only a limited number of studies. The studies we've seen, they've been in major home appliances, in automobiles, in semiconductors, and in consumer electronics, consistently show better Japanese quality. More reliable products, better performance, and frequently you get it with some additional features as well.
Well, give us an example of a plant.
Okay. Why don't we take air conditioners? It's a product I've looked at some. I'll never forget visiting a Japanese factory where the managers took me around and explained to me this was the identical factory that was built by an American company some 15 or 20 years ago in the United States. The difference was that they had quality levels, products that broke down 50 to 100 times less than the American companies. How did they do it? They had fine-tuned the assembly process. They had little fixtures to make sure that parts were placed properly so that workers couldn't make mistakes. They had very detailed tests before the product was even built, before it got off the drawing boards, to make sure it worked properly. They repeated the test 5 and 6 times. In the United States, they did that just once. And perhaps most important, there was an ethic that came down from top management that said the #1 priority at this company is quality.
What are the key 3 or 4 characteristics in terms of the management that made those air conditioners so much better than ours?
Well, first of all, it's how they manage the production process, which is they try to control all of these variations through statistics. The second is that they very carefully thought through the design so that it's easy to make.
They make simpler air conditioners than we do.
It's not so much that they're simpler as that they're manufacturable. The tools are well designed and set up to make this particular product. They actually have more parts, so they're not just simple units. Another difference is they train their workers incessantly. Whether it's simple tasks, they'll train them as much as 6 months so they can master every job along the assembly line. Or if it's complex tasks, like welding, they'll have them practice every week to get better and better at it.
All the time?
All the time. In fact, there are contests. Who is the best welder in the company?
We don't do that.
We don't do that. The training time for welders was often on the job and amounted to at most 1 or 2 hours.
Now, what do they do about paying them? Doesn't it cost them money? Aren't they wasting money, in effect, to have these welding contests?
It certainly costs them money up front. But the important distinction here is that what costs up front, what you pay for up front, you more than save because you don't have to pay warranty claims. You don't have units to fix after the fact. You don't have big repair areas in your factories where you waste additional time. All of those, the benefits more than outweigh these additional costs in design, in training, in improved production methods.
There are stories about the Japanese having much more completely automated plants than we have. Is that the case across the board, or is that isolated?
It's isolated, and the reason is that there's a basic principle of Japanese factory management that most Americans don't understand. I remember a Japanese saying to me once, the major problem with automatic machinery is it tends to produce mistakes automatically.
That is to say that it runs by computer and there's a glitch in the system, and so it replicates mistakes.
It will replicate that same mistake again and again and again. Their view is, first you understand how to make the product. Then you get better and better at it manually. And only then do you automate. Understand first, automate second. Now, we have many counterexamples. General Motors, unfortunately, is the best example of that, where first they automated to solve problems. They didn't understand how to make the product well enough, repeatedly made the same mistakes over and over.
Now, it's often the one excellent example is the Fremont, California General Motors plant, and yet whatever qualities they have there have not translated to General Motors in general. Why is that?
Well, it has to do with the bias that General Motors has about how you get quality. General Motors tends to think, by and large, you automate in quality. You put in fancy equipment, and that's the way you get superiority. The Fremont plant is based on the Toyota production system. It's the system Toyota uses to make its cars.
Which is?
The idea is that you make in small units, relatively small number of models. You do it what's called just in time, which is you don't have large batches of parts waiting. You deliver them to the assembly line directly when they're necessary. You require absolutely perfect quality, because if you're going to make 100 units, you order only 100 parts, no excess. They've got to be exactly right. Now, to make that system work requires very tight coordination, tremendous work from labor in terms of understanding the system, making it go, and very close collaboration with suppliers. Those are all system changes. It's not high technology. That's not a view that has sunk in yet at General Motors.
Are there cases where the United States has improved its quality?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have several examples in computers and in autos where the United States producers are now almost on par, and in some cases to superior to the Japanese.
And how do they get that way?
Well, they've done it through a series of steps. The first is that top management commitment. When senior managers have gotten serious, the best example here is Ford. They spent years up front designing the car properly, finding the best way to make it as well as to make it attractive. And then when they got to the plants, to the factories, which are U.S. plants, they said to the managers of those plants, something between 50 and 70% of your salary is going to be key to how you do on customers' perceptions of the quality of that product.
The definition of quality seems to involve knowing what your consumer wants. Now, how do you find that out?
Well, you've got to go out and talk to them. You've got to survey them through techniques like focus groups, where you sit groups of people around and you ask them to tell you what's a quality automobile or what's a quality color television. You find out there's some very clear categories. How often does it fail? How well does it perform? If it's a TV, does it pull in the picture clearly? What kind of features does it have? Does it have automatic tuning if it's a television? Does it have cotton permapress cycles in a washing machine? Is it appealing? Physically, visibly. This is the fits and finishes we hear about on Japanese autos. You can run through those categories and ask people what really matters. Turns out that people are quite clear in their preferences. One of the reasons the Japanese did so well in autos is for years the American company said a high-quality car is a Cadillac. Lots of features, lots of luxury. What consumers were saying is a high-quality car doesn't fail. That's why Toyota did so well.
If somebody if say you become the president of a company, and you're facing foreign competition, and you really want to redo this company and make it a top quality company, what do you do?
The very first thing you do is you try to understand what quality means to your customers. It's all too easy to say we know it when we see it. It's much harder to go out and find out what the customer wants. First, find out what they want. Second, send a signal loud and clear throughout the organization that this matters, which means you probably have to tie it into incentives, to the way people are being paid. And third, look for a highly visible event to signal that the world has changed. In some cases, it means holding up the release of a new product because it's not exactly right, which is what they did at Xerox. In some cases, it means setting an extremely aggressive goal, the tenfold improvement in quality they set at Hewlett-Packard. But somehow signal to the workforce and your rungs of management that you mean business, that you're competing in a different way.
And what other things do you have to do in your management in order to establish quality?
The biggest thing you can do is get the design people to work up front with the manufacturing people. It's all too easy to design a product which looks beautiful but simply can't be made right in the factory. Get those people to work together from the inception, from the time when you have this design just in the stage of drawings or blueprints, and make sure that that carries through every stage of the design, from the conception, through the market research, development of the quality plans, through the early production, the first few units. So when you get to volume, when you're making lots and lots of these products, you in fact can make it error-free.
America's workers are on the front lines of the battle to restore U.S. industrial competitiveness, and their jobs depend on America's success in the global marketplace. Is it time for the U.S. to look to its competitors for lessons in the workplace? Janice McCormick is an expert on organizational behavior.
How much of America's competitiveness problem can be attributed to labor management relations?
I think a lot of the problems of competitiveness can be attributed to labor management relations. Certainly a lot of it has to do with poor strategic decisions, insufficient investment in technology. But we have to look at the fact that certain of the old labor management relations that we've had in our traditional industries are directly responsible for the decline. We can no longer have a worker who owns his or her own job, his or her own task.
You mean by seniority and
That's
so on?
correct. By seniority, by job assignments, by union contract rules that say that this particular category of employee only does this particular widget. We can't do that anymore.
Mm-hmm. And is that changing?
Some unions have been responsive on that, but some haven't. Mm-hmm. More of them are going to have to come around, in my mind. Mm-hmm. So we're going to have to gain a competitive edge by managing better, managing more flexibly, and better strategic decisions, better technological decisions.
In what ways are the Japanese different from the way we handle labor management relations, and are they better overall?
What we're seeing now with the changing exchange rates between the yen and the dollar, and that is that they're almost equal. There's no longer, we can't say that the currency is alone responsible for the differences. We look at it now, and you could say that a Japanese worker and an American worker are now probably comparably compensated. Okay. Still, the Japanese companies are more competitive, more productive, produce cars of higher quality, products of higher quality, faster, more productively. Why is that? I think it's because of a much better fit of the business's goals and strategies and the human resource management policies. Everybody in a Japanese organization works together for the overall goals of the company. There's none of this them and us. Mm-hmm. Them and us is the competition and us, not management versus employees. Mm-hmm. Everybody's working together in a Japanese organization. We've got to come to that in order to address the task. That's what I mean by managing better.
What does a Japanese, what's the difference? What happens in a Japanese plant that doesn't happen in an American plant?
Okay. First of all, management is much closer to the employees.
That is, they mix
They're
together.
on the shop floor. They don't really look that different. Management trainees start out living in the dormitories with the workers to learn what the culture is, work on production lines. For their first year, sometimes 3 years, I've been in companies where they've been on production lines as part of their career progression.
Harvard Business School graduates don't go to production lines.
My goodness, when my students think about that, they say, oh, we can't do that here. We wouldn't do it. We'd go somewhere else.
How do the Europeans compare in their employee management relations as compared to us?
Yeah. I see a general, with globalization of product markets, I see a general worldwide convergence of practice. Everybody knows that what they need in order to compete is a better fit of their business strategy with the competitive environment and have to have the human resource management policies that support that strategy. So I see in every country in the world companies groping to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. Now, they're not always going to be able to do it the same way because of different industrial structures, different trade union movement structures, different labor law, different roles of the state, of the government involved in the process.
What's the experience of Japanese companies coming here?
They make the assumption that people want to work, that people want to be proud of their work, that they like to work. They recruit people very selectively. They're not going to recruit just anybody off the street. They want to make sure they get the right kind of person that has the psychological profile to work that way. Mm-hmm. And then as a result, they assume that everyone who's made it through that is going to want to work, is going to want to contribute. And sure enough, it isn't magic, but sure enough, when you trust people and you recruit carefully and you manage them well, they will work hard. We haven't made that assumption traditionally in American companies, that people want to work and want to do a good job.
If we want to do things the Japanese way, do we have to move to lifetime employment as a model? Do we have to pick that up too?
Yeah. Well, I think that if management is going to ask employees to trust them, and management is going to trust employees, there's got to be some commitment to retention more so than we've had in the past. Employees are not going to be expendable parts. When the bottom line for the quarter looks bad, we can't just cut heads. There's nothing that's going to destroy trust more quickly than that.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't look at it as a constraint. I look at it as an asset. If you are carefully recruiting, selectively training and promoting, and rewarding people for their efforts, you want to keep them.
Mm-hmm.
So what I see worldwide in the work that I've been doing in companies on 3 continents is more and more companies are working toward a system of retention. It doesn't have to be a lifetime employment guarantee. And even in Japan, that isn't 100% the case. But we're working towards how are we going to keep these people once we've developed them. It's with a positive angle instead of a negative angle that it's had in the past.
Now, is this the philosophy that you're enunciating? Is that traditional at the Harvard Business School? And are you training these young new managers to go out there and be the cooperative boss that you're describing?
Well, I'm not training them to be the cooperative boss. I'm training them to be good managers. And I'm telling them that good management understands its business environment, understands what it has to do to make money, and explores different options. And in many cases, these options include a whole different structure of employee relations. And I'm saying that it's been proven that other assumptions about why people work are more effective.
Ms. McCormick, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
For American Interests, this is Morton Kondracki.
American Interests is made possible by IBM and Pfizer Inc. and these leading foundations.